Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily. And if you want more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving to our today's first story, about how Opus taught a lifelong lesson to his neighbor, who stole from his house and then belittled him. So Opus took away his most precious thing from him and taught him a hard lesson. Now story. My name is Mark. I'm a 32-year-old man with a successful career and a successful life. However, I have an unfortunate ability to attract weirdos. And by weirdos, I mean individuals ranging anywhere from crazy idiots to straight-up criminals. The most recent example would be my current next-door neighbor, I guess. To explain how things got to this point, I will need to go back to the beginning. I live in the suburbs, in a nice neighborhood, the kind that's preferred by middle-class families with kids. I'm a single man, and very out of place in the neighborhood. The only reason I live here, and not nearer to my workplace in the city, in an apartment, is that I love the peace. But lately, there hasn't been much of that. I moved here 5 years ago and had never had any trouble with the neighbors. Everyone that lived in the street was polite, well-mannered, and stayed out of each other's way and businesses. Sure, there were the occasional kids who rode their bikes in my driveway or came over to fetch runaway balls, but that was it. The house next to mine had been empty when I moved in. However, 2 years after my arrival, news reached me that the house was, at last, going to have an occupant. It was announced at the weekly neighborhood meeting, and we were told that we would be throwing a housewarming party for him the weekend after he moved in. My neighbors on the left side were a middle-aged couple with 2 kids, and I was excited to see who was going to move in. We had been told that his name was Adam Walters, and like me, he was a single man of 30-odd years. I had been ecstatic upon finding that out, since I thought I might be making a new friend in the neighborhood. Not to sound snobby, but I hardly had anything in common with the dads living near me. I had anxiously waited around on moving day and had not been disappointed. He got out of a fashionable car and started moving boxes out of the trunk and back seat. A dog hopped out of the passenger seat and barked twice. He was a German Shepherd and quite large in size. He ran around the man, yapping and nipping at his heels. Most of the furniture had already been moved in by a moving company almost a week back. I ran out of the house, offering to help. I introduced myself. He looked me up and down, then nodded and gestured for me to pick up a box and follow him into the house. He asked me if I was his next-door neighbor. I answered affirmatively, and then he asked whether I had any family. I replied that I lived alone, just like him. He seemed pleased with the answer and then asked what I did. I told him that I worked a 9-to-5 job. He again looked pleased and then said, almost to himself, "So you won't be around for most of the day?" I was a bit taken aback but answered, "Yes, I won't be home for most of the day." He said he worked from home since his dog didn't like to be alone for too long. We finished moving the boxes inside, and then he said that he was incredibly thirsty. I immediately offered to fix him a drink and invited him inside my house. We went inside, the dog following us. A strange thing I noticed was that Adam looked around a lot. He asked me whether there were any cameras on the front porch. I laughed, saying that this was a very safe neighborhood and that very few houses in the street had front cams. And I certainly wasn't one of them. He then asked to use the bathroom and I pointed him down to the hall. He excused himself, leaving me alone with his dog. I thought about how he was a nice enough guy and wondered if he would be up for drinks with me or a football night sometimes. When Adam exited the bathroom, he thanked me and said it was time to go home. He had a lot of unpacking to do. I bid him farewell, thinking that it had gone rather well. That was where the problem with Adam had started, although I wouldn't known about it for quite some time. Later that week, I invited Adam for a drink in the city. He was happy to join me, and happy to, as I found out much later, pump me for information about the house and the monetary value of my possessions. It had started with simple questions, like asking me when we could watch a game of football, and how big my TV was. Idiotically, I boasted about my promotion at work recently, after which I had brought a large number of things for the house, a huge, latest technology TV among them. He asked me about my clothing style and mentioned that he loved expensive watches. I immediately threw in the fact that I was an impulsive buyer, and watches were something I wholeheartedly believed in splurging on. What I hadn't noticed, and should have, was that Adam told me very few details about his own life. All he talked about was his dog, Charlie, and how much he loved him. He also told me a little about his work, some job for a startup that required him to work remotely. All in all, I got the impression that he was a quiet guy, with a lovely dog and a nice, quiet job. The first incident happened 2 weeks later. I came home at my usual time, around 5:30, and was putting my watch back in the case, when I noticed the 2 watches missing. A Rolex and a Patek Philippe which my GF gave me. Both had cost me a fortune, and I loved them. Thinking that I had just put them somewhere else, I started searching the house. No luck, I couldn't find them. A niggling suspicion was in the back of my mind. One of the only people I had told about the watches was Adam. I brushed the thought away, refusing to believe that he could have taken them. I decided I must have misplaced them and told myself to stop worrying too much. The second incident happened a month later. I got home one Friday and my TV was gone, with a large space on the wall where it had been. I couldn't believe my eyes. A whole TV is gone. Once again, I thought about Adam and how he had been interested in TV. I immediately called the cops and reported the incident to them. They asked me for details about the last time I saw the TV and whether something else had been taken. I told them about the watches that had gone missing. They then asked me if I suspected anyone of stealing my things. Reluctantly, I gave them Adam's name as I still wasn't sure that it was him. They went next door and knocked at the door. Adam answered, and the police told him that there had been a robbery next door. They asked him if he knew anything about it, and he said no. The officers then asked him whether it would be fine if they checked inside the house. He told them they were welcome to come inside and invited me in as well. The officers searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of either the watches or the TV. Confused, I told myself that I must have been wrong. The officers told me that there was nothing they could do about it since there was no evidence. I thanked them for their time and saw them off. When I got back, I saw Adam standing in the driveway. He asked me what all of that had been about. I said that a couple of things had been stolen. Smirking, he said he'll miss watching the game on my TV. Laughing, he slapped my shoulder and headed to his house. Chills went down my back. The police hadn't told him which items had been taken. He had done the crime and was trying to rub it in my face. Enraged, I walked over and knocked on his door. When he answered, I told him I knew it was him and to return everything he stole. He smiled slyly and said that he had no idea what I was talking about and that I should have evidence before making outlandish claims. Belatedly, I realized that this was the reason he had asked about the cameras. The last thing he said was that I should be careful in case the thief strikes again. Bowling with rage, I returned home. I made a mental note to install cameras as soon as possible. Without any evidence, I had no choice but to plot my revenge. I thought about it long and hard. I considered breaking into his house and stealing something of similar value, but then I thought that I didn't know whether he had cameras installed anywhere. For all I knew, he might anticipate it and was waiting to catch me. No, I would have to come up with another way. While I was waiting and plotting, he struck again, and this time, he crossed all boundaries. You see, the company I work at has branches all across the country. For some legal purposes, I had asked a representative of another branch to mail me some documents. I could have gotten them in an electronic form, but for some reason that I won't go into, the hard copy of the original document was required. Now my counterpart from the other branch was going to deliver them to me directly. They were extremely important for a case I had been working on. He drove across the state to deliver them to me. Unfortunately, I had an errand to run that day and couldn't meet him in person. He called me from the front of the house and told me he was there. I told him to leave them on the doorstep since I wouldn't be home for a while. He did so and left. When I got home, there was no package on the doorstep. I rang my neighbors and asked them if they'd seen anything. They said they hadn't. I had no choice but to go over to Adam's house and ask if he'd taken them. Once again, he laughed and said why would he do anything like that. Feigning concern, he asked if they were important. I almost hit him out of anger. I controlled myself, telling myself that my time would come. I turned around and went home. It took a lot of apologizing and working overtime to fix the damage this had caused at work. But I soon came up with the perfect revenge. I would take what was most dear to him, Charlie. It took a while to get him. Scared that his house had cameras, I couldn't go over to his property, but I could lure Charlie to mine. And since there was a hedge blocking the view from his house to mine, I could potentially make it work. One day, on a weekend, I spotted Charlie roaming around Adam's driveway. All I had to do was put yesterday's leftover chicken, laced with a healthy dose of sleeping pills, on the driveway near the hedge. And he came trotting right over, enticed by the smell. I watched from inside my house as he gobbled up the chicken, and then fell unconscious. Score. Checking to see that nobody was around, I quickly took Charlie inside. Then I backed up my car close to the front door and waited for night to fall. When it was dark, I drugged Charlie again and put him in the trunk of my car. The next day, Sunday, I drove across the state and dropped him off at a shelter in another city. Before dropping him off, I had removed all marks of ownership, including his collar, and told the people there that I had found him wandering on the road. Satisfied, I drove back to my city and house, reaching just before evening fell. As soon as I pulled up to the driveway, Adam stormed over. He shouted at me that he knew what I had done and to give his dog back at this instant. As he had done before, I feigned ignorance, telling him I didn't know what he was talking about. He roared that he would contact the police, to which I calmly replied, "Do you have any evidence that I took your dog?" He yelled at me some more but knew that ultimately there was nothing he could do. He yelled at me that I would regret it, to which I quietly replied, "No you will, as I'm not done yet." He stormed back to his house. Satisfied, I went inside to plot my next step. The police showed up the next day. Adam had called them and they were going around the neighborhood, asking people if they'd seen the dog. He'd also posted an ad in the newspaper for a missing dog. The police said that Charlie was last seen rounding the corner to my house, picked up by cameras Adam had installed on his porch. I innocently stated that I hadn't seen him and that unless the cameras had caught me doing anything, I was guilt-free. The police, after not getting anywhere, advised everyone in the neighborhood to get cameras installed. Having found out that Adam's property did indeed have cameras, I chose a different route for revenge. The next day, I went all the way across the city and phoned Adam from a payphone. I went in complete disguise, in a mask, sunglasses, and a hat so I wouldn't be recognized. I pretended to be a stranger and told Adam that I had come across a dog that looked remarkably like his wandering around the freeway. I had seen the ad in the newspaper and had called him thinking that it might be his dog. He thanked me and hung up. Now all that remained was to get there before him. I hailed a cab and got there as fast as I could. It was getting dark and there were remarkably few cars on the freeway at that time. I hid and waited at the spot. Once again, I had taken care to wear gloves and cover my hair with a surgical cap and hat. I didn't want any DNA linking me to the scene. Shortly after I got there, Adam pulled up. I jumped him with a crowbar, hitting his leg before he could turn around. I then threw away the crowbar and hit him with my fists, making sure my face was hidden. He was a lot smaller than me, and I had no problem beating him up. After I was done, I got into his car and drove it off the road into a ditch. I took pity on him and left his phone with him, to make sure he could call somebody when he regained consciousness. My work is done. I walked a little distance on the freeway before taking my outer clothes off and hailing a truck. The truck driver was nice and offered me a ride into the city. Next, I went to my buddy's house and told him that if the police ever came knocking, I had been at his house all evening. He agreed. After that, I went home to enjoy my evening. The next time I saw Adam was a week later. He got out of a cab, walking on crutches. The dutiful neighbor that I was, I hurried outside, loudly asking what had happened. A few people from the neighborhood also came round, asking the same question. He told everyone that he had gotten mugged recently and that he was fine now. All the time he gave me a death glare. When we were alone, I delivered the parting shot, telling him that the medical bills he had racked up in the hospital surely amounted to more than he had stolen from me. Admitting defeat, he turned around and went to his house. I'm sure he won't be stealing anything else for a very, very long time. Now, here is the end of first story. I hope you enjoyed it, and you can also share your opinion about this story in the comments section. And guys, please stay safe. So before moving to the second story, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories. Now, moving to our today's second story, about how OP teaches a salesman a lesson to never judge a book by its cover, which was very petty but satisfying to watch. Now story. This happened back around in 1988 or 1990. I was a petty officer in the Coast Guard and stationed at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. At the time, this was located on SW 7th, across the street from Elephant Center. So the easiest way to get to work was to take the metro. Since I was being barracked at Fort Myers, I could take one of the hourly free buses to the Pentagon, catch the metro into Washington, get off at Elephant Plaza and just walk across the street. Not the best commute, but fairly easy. However, if I had to work late, then I'd end up having to either grab a taxi or use the public bus system for at least part of the trip, which I hated doing in uniform. In short, I wanted to buy a car. I hadn't needed one up to this point, but the benefits of having one finally outweighed the costs, and I was in the market, as they say. The only other possible background I should need to explain is SRB. The Selective Reenlistment Bonus Program might still be a bribe to get men and women to reenlist or extend their enlistment by offering a bonus equal to one's base pay times your rating's current multiplier ratings. The military needed more got higher multipliers, while those they had plenty of might only get a 1 or even not get any SRB times the number of years one reenlisted for. In my case, at that place and time, my rating had a multiplier of 5 and I had a base pay of around $1,200, so when I reenlisted for 6 years, I found myself with a bonus of roughly $35,000, a perfect time to buy a car. Now, the usual way one received one's SRB was in yearly installments. However, if you could convince your command that you needed it, it was possible to get it all in a lump sum. This was frowned on if only due to the tax hassle it created for the service member, but it could be done. I wanted to buy a car. My command agreed that buying a car was a good investment, and after having me sign all sorts of paperwork acknowledging that I would be far smarter to do yearly payments, they handed me, a young man in his 20s, a check for the lump sum. Okay, this is where the stupidity begins. I didn't have a bank account. What can I say? Like a car, I hadn't needed one, so I simply cashed my paycheck every couple of weeks and either locked it up or carried it on me. Like I said, stupid, and I know better now. So, intending to buy a car the next day, I walked my dopey ass across the street and cashed my reenlistment bonus check at the bank we all used for paydays. It wasn't easy, but it was near the end of the day and the manager of the bank was used to our business, so I ended up with 6 or 7 envelopes stuffed with cash, crammed in various uniform pockets. And, no, I was still young enough that I never even considered that I could be robbed. So, not being a total idiot, I flagged down a cab and was on my way back to the barracks when we passed the Porsche dealership. On a whim, I had the taxi double back and let me off there. I was under no illusion that I could actually buy one, but $35,000 would be a nice down payment, maybe enough to let me afford the rest on monthly payments. I walked in and spent a few minutes checking out the prices of a 911 Carrera Coupe and was astonished to discover that I could cover over half the base sticker. About that time, a salesman walked over. Perfect. But before I could ask about financing, the salesman tried to give me the bum's rush. He was polite, sorta, but the overall message was one of "this is all too much for you, sailor boy. So move along and quit bringing down the overall class of our dealership, okay?" I stared at him for a long moment and then asked, "How much does this model right here cost?" He gave a small sniff and replied that it was over $50,000, plus tax. So, I took out an envelope, tore it open, and started counting $100 bills onto the hood of the car. When that envelope was empty, I pulled out another and kept counting. By the 4th envelope, I was down to 50s and had around 30 grand in cash stacked in piles of 5,000 on the hood, and was pleased to see that the salesman was now sweating ever so slightly. I pulled the last envelope out and stopped. I looked the salesman in the eye and asked how much his commission was. He licked dry lips and told me it was around 20% of gross. I smiled, picked up the cash, and stuffed it back into my pockets while saying, "Forget it. I'll come back tomorrow and deal with somebody who respects the military." Then I left. I had to walk several blocks to find a taxi and was nervous as hell with all that loose cash, but got back to the barracks safely. I bought a used Olds the next day. Now, here is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know your opinion about this story in the comments section. And please stay safe. So before leaving, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.